Hi, and now we're entering into week 12, and we're going to divide this chapter into two. And this first part, in week 12, we'll be looking at population. Now, what I want you to pay attention to here is we're going to look at some of the basic sort of sociological perspectives of looking at population. And there's a particular term for this, it's called demography. And it's a study of population, looking at population composition, beginning at the beginning part about growth and perspectives about how population grows. So we're going to look then at population growth and the global context and what are the implications. Now, of course, some of the videos that I've posted in the journals that you've been able to watch look at population growth through Hans Rosling, and so some of what you'll see in your textbook is a little more dated than what Hans's material is. For testing purposes, we're going to use textbook material because it's something that you can use for your study purposes. And then we're going to look at what are some of the major social processes affecting population. Now, you've heard terms like immigration, certainly in the more recent years, but we're going to look at terms like that and some definitions and how that affects population. So some questions you might carry with you as you go through this chapter and listen to this video is, what are the causes of global population growth? Why does it happen? How are changes affected by population changes? So how are the changes affected by population changes? And then lastly, we're going to look a little bit at and touch on the impact of the baby boom and what it's had on Canada's population, and also if we look at the baby boom bust. So that's all we're going to look at for this particular chapter, week 13. The second part of this chapter, we'll look at urbanization. All right, so we are getting very close to the end, and let's carry on with this discussion of looking at population. Population growth in Canada has slowed, yet worldwide there's been a significant increase. Now, the world population is about 6.5 billion. That was in 2010. It's closer to 7 to 7.5 billion in 2017, with about 80 million increase each year. Now, by 2050, there will be an estimated 9.1 billion people in the world. So where are they? Well, mostly not in the developed country in terms of the population growth, but you can tell by this demonstrated picture here that a lot of the population is in highly, in lower income nations, if you can tell through the color there. And so these issues interest sociologists. And the study that they use for this is what's called demography. And it's a subfield of sociology that examines population size, the population composition, and distribution. Where in the country or in the world are these populations distributed? And this study affects social policies, it affects economics. It's quite a significant feature. Now, demographers define population as a group of people who live in a specific geographic area. So if you're studying the population of Canada, that's the geographic area that is Canada, and you're studying the population, that group of people who live in that specific area. Now, population is affected by a number of things: fertility, mortality, migration, population composition, even the baby boom and the baby bust. And we're going to look at all of these. So we'll begin with fertility. Now, fertility by definition is the actual level of childbearing for an individual or a population. Now, the primary focus is biological, which usually refers to women who are between the ages of 15 and 45. Now, that's considered to be the sort of biological age by which you can produce babies. Now, of course, you can have babies even earlier than 15 and certainly older than 45. But by definition, that's what fertility represents. Now, when we look at a variety of these other features, now you can notice here where you see that the Canadian fertility rates have dramatically decreased from, in 1871, having 7 children per woman between the ages of 15 and 45, where it went down dramatically to current times where it's less than 2 per woman in that age group. Now you do see a bump there in the 50s through to the 60s, and that's what's known as the baby boom. And we'll look at that a little bit later. So the other terms you need to be familiar with, one is what's called the crude birth rate. Now crude birth weight is the number of live births per 1,000 people in the population in any given year. Okay? Now there's low birth rates and high birth rates. The low birth rates would be examples you'd see in Japan at 7.2, in Italy 8.4, Germany 8.2, Canada and the UK around 10.7, and in the US about 14. So these are considered low birth rates, whereas high birth rates are in places like Nigeria, Somalia, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, where the number is up to 35. Now you can see there alternatively is what's known as the crude death rate. Now this is the number of deaths per 1,000 people in a population, where in many countries the mortality is 2 to 3 times as high as in low income, as in high income countries. Now it brings us to another term, which is mortality. Now mortality by definition is the incidence of death in a population, and it's studied through the crude death rate. Now if we carry on, we also have what's known as the infant mortality rate. And this is the number of deaths of infants under 1 year of age per 1,000 live births in any given year. Now you can see how these rates are based on 1,000 of the population in any given year. Now you can go to Stats Canada, you can go to the WHO organization. A number of these places have these live birth rates, crude death rates and birth rates. Now if you go to the Gapminder site and look at the data there, you can find it there certainly. Now the other term that's used when looking at populations is what's known as life expectancy. Now you remember this from your assignment, where the estimate, life expectancy is the estimate of the average lifetime in years of people born in a specific year. In part, this is a part of declining mortality rates where we see this number increasing. Countries with high birth rates also have high infant mortality rates. And Hans Rosling's video on population growth gives some explanation as to why that is. All right, let's move along to now looking at migration and population composition. Now in this particular part, we're going to look at a number of things. We're going to start with looking at migration, or the movement of people from one geographic area to another for the purposes of changing residency. And there's 2 types of these. There's the immigration, which is movement of people into a geographic area to take up residency, and emigration, which is the movement of people out of one geographic area to take up residency somewhere else. And this is the main way in which populations shift, whether it be in distribution, composition, and this of course has a big impact on any country where immigration and emigration occurs. So you would be an immigrant if you move from one country to another. You would be an emigrant if you move from one area of a country to another area of a country. Now there's some subtypes to migration. Internal migration is the movement within a geographic area. And so we saw in 1867, 80% of the people lived in rural areas. In 2000, 80% lived in urban areas. And we'll talk about more of that in the next week. International is from one country, international migration that is, from one country to another. And we see an example of where the immigration percentage came from what countries in 1957 compared to 2008. And I would imagine if we were to look at the data that we would find in 2017, that the country distribution of immigration will have changed again. Now in relationship to migration is another term, or another couple of terms, and they're called the push and pull. And so we're going to touch on that in just a second here. I'll pull that up now. Push factors and pull factors. Now, pull factors are reasons to go to another country because of what is there. Either you find safety, opportunity, stability, freedom. There's reasons to go there because you're drawn to it. Whereas push reasons would be reasons to leave where you are living. Maybe it's religious oppression or poverty, fear, disaster, unemployment. So migration occurs either because you're pulled towards another part of the world where the opportunities are improved or better, or you're pushed because of where you are. That's not a positive place, not a good place to raise your family, or not a good place to live for yourself. Now, to move on, we have what's called population composition. This is the biological and social characteristics of population. There's sex ratio, which is the number of males for every 100 females in a given population. And so sex and age statistics are significant to population characteristics. And what we have to look at is this. This is what's known as a population pyramid, which is a graphic representation of the distribution of population by sex and age. Now, if you look at, the 2031, it looks a bit like a rectangle. But if you go back to 1961, you're seeing what looks like roughly a triangle. And at the base of the triangle would be all the number of children compared to the rest of the population. And you're seeing a very significant bulb at the bottom, which suggests a very big youthful population, which is a healthy sign of a society, if you will, in terms of its ability to replicate and make use of the population and employees in the future. Then if you go to 1981, to back up a bit, it's 1961, you're seeing the result of the baby boom. And if you notice in 1981, 20 years later, there's the baby boom moving up through to the 20 to 35, 40 age group. But you also notice that the population at the bottom has started to diminish, not as many children being born. Now, as the years went on, we sort of produced less children because we got, more focused on post-secondary education, finding work, and all these other characteristics that put people off from having as many children by starting out their lives in a married life and creating a family a little later in life. Then you move to 2006, and you start to notice that boom has moved up to the 40, up to the 65 range. And again, the number of children being born has diminished even further. And then what's predicted for 2031 is this very big area of older Canadians and a very small population of children being born, which is what's prompted, immigration to be such an important thing in Canada, for example. So the baby boom is a dramatic increase that occurred between 1946 and 1966. So you might ask why, and as I mentioned, couples married young at that time. They had large families, and after World War II, when Canada experienced an economic boom, this made it possible for families to really start to prosper and have more children. What's known as the baby bust was a fall in the birth rates from about 1966 to the present, and you see in that population pyramid that effect occur in these population pyramids. So the impact of the baby boom was an expansion of markets. There was more schools being developed and constructed, more university enrollment increased, construction of churches, and the result of the baby bust has been, as you would imagine, fewer schools. So we see closures of schools as a result. So in the future, pensions to support the older population is going to make it really difficult when you don't have as many workers paying within their taxes to support the government's paying of old age security and CPP, the Canada Pension Plan. And so this puts a burden on the overall population on how that's going to happen. And there's also going to be an increased use of healthcare facilities. So those of you who are in pre-health or in PSW or in nursing will find work for quite a few years, it appears. Now, some of the issues, well, the baseline fertility rate for the reproduction of a society is around, in Canada, is around about 2.1, which means that those women who are fertile between the ages of 15 and 45, as was the fertility rates, if they produce 2.1 children per woman, then that maintains the growth of the population. Now, the lower fertility rates, which is where we are now at 1.5 per fertile woman, well, and that's why immigration has been a big part of what's happened in Canada to replace that growth of population that's required to maintain the success of a population. So if we carry on, we'll start with, this whole issue around population. The problem is, of course, can our population, or can our planet support our expanding population? And we're going to look at 4 theories around this. Now, one of them will be called Malthusian Perspective. The second will be the Marxist Perspective, and then a more current version of Malthusian, which is the Neo-Malthusian. And then lastly will be demographic transition theory. Okay, so let's begin with Malthusian. Now, this is an older version. This is way back. I mean, they were thinking about population growth back in the 18th century. And Malthus, he was born in 1766 and died in 1834. And his theory around population growth was that the physical supplies of food would increase arithmetically. That just means it will increase steadily on a trajectory upward. However, the population would increase exponentially, which is much more rapid. And thus the population growth would outstrip the food supply. Now, what he called positive checks, these would be the things that would have a positive impact on the lowering of population. That he would describe as mortality risks like famines, disease, and war. This would sort of correct some of that exponential versus arithmetical increases. And then the preventative checks would be limits to fertility. Now, this is an older perspective, but it tells you a bit about how long were they thinking about the issues of population growth. This was at a time when there was barely even a billion people on Earth. If we move to the conflict perspective, or more accurately, the Marxist perspective, why overpopulation? Well, because capitalists want to have a surplus of workers so that they can suppress wages. The more workers you have, the more competition for jobs, in which case you can get people to work for less money. And by doing that, they were forcing workers to be more productive. Well, you could easily be replaced. So people were really productive for less wages, and that would be the theory, and that would keep people down and keep them working, if you will. Now, the overpopulation component would lead to the demise of capitalism. Then if you had too many people, it would make it more difficult to work in a capitalist society. But there was a problem with the theory. Socialist countries that were not capitalist countries were also having the same problems. And so that seems to diminish the significance of that particular theory, although not completely. Now, alternatively, to add to a newer version of Malthusian was the Neo-Malthusian Perspective. Now, the premise of this theory is essentially the same, that the arithmetic increase of the food supply and the exponential growth of population was still the same, but in spite of the increased food production, about 2% of the population supplies our food supplies, and an overabundance of food products, the population would outstrip the potential to sustain it. So the high resource consumption would lead to a significant environmental changes in soil, water, and climatic instability, which would lead to riots, violence, and war. Lastly, we'll look at the demographic transition theory. Now, the demographic transition theory is a process by which some societies have moved from a high birth rate and high death rates to relatively low birth rates and death rates as a result of technological developments. Now, if you go to page 408 in your textbook and look at figure 16.6, you'll see a graph that represents this theory. Now, if you're looking at the stage 1, 2, and 3, and 4 here, this looks at with more and more technological advancement to a society. We moved from a pre-industrial society where the birth rates were high, you had large families, and the death rates were high. People didn't live long. To early industrialization societies where the birth rates were still high, but the death rates were starting to lower. People lived longer. They had more successes, eating better. The advanced industrialized societies had low birth rates and low death rates. As we got more advanced and more technologically advanced, we had better abilities to look after ourselves. So people who were, when children were born, more of them lived. And we had lower birth rates because you didn't need to have a lot of children in order to have a few survive. And the death rates were lower. People lived longer, and when people did die, they were certainly beyond their working ability. And then the post-industrial is continued lower birth rates with a stable death rate. Now the evidence for this is that countries which have industrialized have had lower birth rates and lower death rates. Okay, there we go. That's the completion of the chapter on population. So let's carry on. By next week, we'll do urbanization, and then that will complete the semester. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye now.